The universe is a poorly maintained piece of hardware. In my professional opinion, whoever designed the vacuum of space forgot to include a decent surge protector and definitely skimped on the insulation. It is vast, leaky, and prone to catastrophic failure at the most inconvenient times. As a Level 4 systems engineer on the Calum Spire, my entire existence was dedicated to proving that fact to anyone who would listen, which, as it turned out, was absolutely nobody. The Calum Spire was a massive, rotating needle of oxidized steel and flickering neon, perched precariously above the swirling emerald storms of Ignis 7. It was a place where hope came to die and bad coffee came to thrive. I was currently elbow-deep in the primary atmospheric scrubber of Section 9, a place the locals affectionately called the sump. The air here was 70% recycled sweat and 30% metallic tang, and the machine I was fighting was older than my grandfather's regrets. "Come on, you bucket of bolts," I muttered, my voice echoing hollowly inside the ventilation shaft. "Give me a green light, or I am letting the carbon dioxide turn everyone in the mess hall into very quiet statues." The scrubber groaned, a sound like a dying whale in a trash compactor. I wiped grease from my forehead, leaving a dark streak across my pale skin. My synaptic mesh, the neural implant that was supposed to connect me to the glorious collective consciousness of humanity, gave its usual pathetic little spark. It was a dud, a flatline, a biological error. While everyone else on the station was busy sharing their emotional baggage or streaming the latest sensory feed from the inner rim, I was living in a perpetual state of radio silence. To the medical board, I was a void echo, someone whose brain just did not resonate with the mesh. To me, I was just a guy who did not have to listen to his coworkers' opinions about their breakfast or their latest heartbreak. I finished the repair, crawled out of the shaft, and checked my chronometer. It was 1900 hours. The station hummed with a different kind of energy today. It was not the usual rhythmic thumping of the ore crushers. It was a high-frequency vibration of nervous anticipation. The Lumini were arriving. The Lumini were the stuff of high-budget science fiction dramas. They were an ancient race from the Veil Nebula, tall, translucent-skinned, and terrifyingly beautiful. But their main party trick was their empathic resonance. They did not just see you, they felt you. Every secret shame, every hidden desire, every fleeting moment of anger. To Illumini, humans were all screaming our hearts out in a crowded room. "Vane," a voice barked over the local comms. "Get your scruffy ass to the docking ring. All hands on deck for the Exarch's arrival." That was Overseer Graves, a man who treated his subordinates like disposable filters. "I am a grease monkey, Overseer, not a diplomat," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag that was already past its saturation point. "The aliens do not want to see my ugly face. Xenocultural protocols, Vane. Move it! If the Exarch sees one person not standing at attention, the hegemony loses the mining rights to the nebula. And if that happens, I am personally spacing you without a suit." I sighed. Threats of vacuum tossing were a standard part of the corporate greeting here. I packed my kit and headed toward the primary docking ring. The ceremony was as painful as I expected. Half the station's population was lined up in their stiffest uniforms, looking like they were trying to remember how to breathe without looking suspicious. In the center of the ring stood Exarch Thalon. Calling her pretty was like calling a supernova a light bulb. She was tall, draped in a flowing gown of Aegis silk that shimmered from deep violet to a pale, ghostly blue. Her skin had the texture of moonlight, and her eyes were vast, swirling pools of silver. But it was her ears that caught my attention. Long, tapered, and delicately curved, twitching slightly as if catching sounds that did not exist in the physical world. As she walked past the line of dignitaries, her expression was one of practiced regal indifference, but I saw the way her fingers clenched at her sides. I saw the slight tremor in her jaw. She looked like someone trying to swim through a hurricane of invisible hands. When she passed me, she stopped, just for a microsecond. Her silver eyes flicked toward mine. For a moment, the usual static in my head seemed to sharpen into a single, piercing note. I did not feel anything, I never did, but she gasped. It was a tiny sound, lost in the roar of the atmospheric fans, but it was there. Then her handlers ushered her forward, and the parade of perfection continued toward the VIP quarters. "Did she just look at you?" Graves whispered, his face a mask of horrified confusion. "Maybe she liked my grease stains," I said, though my heart was doing a strange, irregular dance against my ribs. Or maybe she just realized I am the only one here who is not thinking about how much he wants a promotion. The rest of the evening was a blur of bureaucratic nonsense. I retreated to my quarters as soon as the overseer turned his back. My room was a glorified storage crate in Section 47, barely 4 meters wide, with a bed that felt like it was stuffed with recycled industrial waste. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring out the tiny reinforced viewport at the swirling green clouds of Ignis 7. I felt nothing. That was the problem, was it not? In a universe of vibrant connections, I was a hollow vessel. I had no resonance. I was just a quiet room in a very loud house. "Well," I whispered to the empty air, "at least the scrubber is fixed." I stripped down to my undershirt, lay back on the hard pillow, and let the rhythmic thrum of the station's fusion core lull me into a dreamless sleep. I was alone, as I had been for 32 years, or so I thought. Waking up is usually a tactical maneuver for me. It involves 3 alarms, a lot of groaning, and a mental checklist of which systems are likely to explode before noon. But this morning was different. The air in my room did not smell like recycled ozone and stale coffee. It smelled like night-blooming jasmine and cold, clean rain. It was a scent that should not exist on a mining station 300 light-years from Earth. The second thing I noticed was the weight. My left arm was pinned down by something warm, soft, and distinctly alive. I opened one eye, then I opened the other. Then I considered closing them both, and hoping I had finally suffered the brain aneurysm my doctor had been predicting for years. Exarch Thalin, the ruler of the 7th house of the Lumini, the woman who held the fate of our corporate contracts in her delicate hands, was fast asleep on my chest. Her head was tucked under my chin, her silver-white hair spilling across my shoulder like a silk waterfall. One of her hands, long, slender fingers, tipped with iridescent nails, was resting right over my heart. She was still wearing her formal Aegis silk robes, though they were now hopelessly rumpled. Her breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmic. My brain did not just stall, it underwent a full system crash. Option 1, scream. Result, security enters, sees the Queen of the Nebula in my bed, executes me on the spot for interstellar kidnapping and being a creep. Option 2, move. Result, she wakes up, realizes she is in a grease monkey's bunk, and her guards execute me on the spot. Option 3, die of embarrassment. Result, my body is found by the cleaning droids in 3 days. Highly preferable. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my breath coming in shallow hitches. I was terrified to move, terrified to stay still. I could feel the heat radiating from her body. For someone who looked like she was made of moonlight, she was surprisingly solid. And then there were her ears. Up close, they were even more intricate, covered in a fine silver down that shimmered as she breathed. Every few seconds they would twitch, brushing against my neck. It was the most intimate thing that had happened to me in 5 years, and it was currently a capital offense. "This is not happening," I whispered to the ceiling. "This is a hallucination brought on by Sector 7 fungus." The Exarch shifted. Her hand tightened slightly on my shirt, her fingers curling into the cheap fabric. She let out a soft, contented sigh and nuzzled closer into the crook of my neck. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake her. But then I remembered what I was. I was the void echo. I was the man with the quiet mind. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. They were not the distant swirling pools of silver I had seen at the docking ring. They were wide, sharp, and momentarily clouded with the disorientation of deep sleep. She did not move. She did not scream. She just stared at the wall of my cabin for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. Then very slowly, she tilted her head back to look at me. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. A level 4 engineer and a galactic sovereign tangled together in a bed that was not even big enough for one person. "You are still here," she said. Her voice was a low melodic thrum, like the resonance of a crystal bowl. It is my room," I managed to croak out. My throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. Contractually speaking, I am supposed to be here. She did not pull away. Instead, she pushed herself up on one elbow, her hair falling around us like a curtain. Her expression was not one of outrage or fear. It was something I had never seen on Illumini before. It was relief, pure, unadulterated relief. The silence, she whispered, her eyes searching mine. It is still here, even when you are awake. I am sorry, I said, my voice rising an octave. If I am being too quiet, I do not know. Hum a tune? What are you doing here, Your Majesty? How did you even get in? Security is supposed to be, well, they are supposed to be better than this. She sat up fully now, kneeling on the narrow mattress. The aegis silk of her dress shimmered a soft pale gray, the color of calm. The doors on this station are designed to keep out physical threats, she said, her voice regaining some of its regal composure, though her hands were still trembling. They are not designed to keep out someone who is desperate for air. Desperate for air? I looked at the scrubber readout on my desk. The oxygen levels are at 98%. I fixed that scrubber yesterday. Thalen let out a small, fragile laugh. Not that kind of air, Daxen Vane. I froze. How do you know my name? I saw it on the roster. But more than that, I felt it when I passed you. Or rather, I felt the absence of it. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from my forehead. My people, we are born into a storm. We feel the echoes of every mind around us. On this station, with its hundreds of stressed, ambitious, fearful humans, it was like being buried alive in a mountain of screaming voices. I have not slept in 20 days. I was breaking. I looked at her, and for the first time I did not see an alien queen. I saw a survivor. And you found me, I said, the pieces finally clicking together, because I am a dud, because my head is empty. Not empty, she corrected softly. Quiet. Your mind is like a deep well of cool water in the middle of a desert. When I stood near your quarters last night, the screaming stopped. For the first time in decades, I could hear my own thoughts. I did not mean to come inside. I only meant to stand by the door for a moment, but then you passed out in my bed. I finished for her. I slept, she said, her voice filled with wonder. I slept for 6 hours. No dreams, no echoes, just peace. I ran a hand through my messy hair, feeling the absurdity of the situation pressing down on me. Look, I am glad my defective brain is a luxury spa for you, but we are in a massive amount of trouble. If the overseer or your guards find you here, they are not going to ask about your sleep quality. They are going to assume I have committed a crime against the galaxy. Thalen looked around my cramped, messy room, the stacks of diagnostic tablets, the stained coffee mugs, the single viewport looking out into the void. Then we shall have to be very careful, she said. She looked back at me, her silver eyes glowing with a sudden, fierce intensity. Because I am not going back to that noise, Daxen. Not tonight, not until the delegation leaves. Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting? I asked, my heart doing that strange dance again. I am an exarch, she said, a hint of her royal steel returning to her voice, and I am tired. I will return to my duties now. But tonight, when the station grows dark, I will come back to the silence. She leaned forward and pressed her palm against my cheek. Her skin was cool, but where she touched me, I felt a strange, tingling warmth. Not a neural connection, but something more basic, something more human. Do not lock your door, engineer, she whispered. And then, with a grace that made my heart ache, she slipped out of the room before I could even find the words to tell her how terrible an idea this was. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty spot on my bed, where a goddess had just been sleeping. The jasmine scent was already fading, replaced by the familiar smell of grease and recycled air. I had a duty shift in 40 minutes. I had scrubbers to fix and filters to change. But as I stood up and started to get dressed, I realized that for the first time in my life, the silence in my head did not feel like a flaw. It felt like a harbor. I checked the time. It was 0600 hours. The morning shift was about to begin, and I had to look like a man who had not just shared a bed with the most important woman in the sector. I grabbed my utility belt, cinched it tight, and took a deep breath. Time to go to work, coghead, I told myself. Just another day in the scrap heap. But I knew it was a lie. My quiet world was about to get very, very loud. The morning shift in the sump was always an exercise in controlled misery, but today it felt like walking through a minefield of invisible judgment. The air in Section 9 was thick enough to chew, flavored with the metallic tang of grinding ore and the sour scent of several hundred workers who had forgotten what a real shower felt like. I was currently wedged into a junction box near the primary cooling lines, trying to convince a rusted circuit breaker that its life still had meaning. "Hey, Daxen, are you actually in there or just hiding from the brass?" The voice belonged to Jax, one of the few pipe runners who did not treat me like I was a contagious disease, mostly because Jax was too overwhelmed by his own life to care that mine was a frequency silent dead zone. I wiped a smear of coolant from my goggles and looked down at him. Jax was leaning against a support pillar, his face pale and his eyes twitching. His synaptic mesh was glowing a frantic, jagged orange. "I am recalibrating the thermal regulators, Jax," I grunted, my voice muffled by the narrow crawl space. "It is a glamorous life, but someone has to do it. Why do you look like you just swallowed a live fusion core?" "The mesh, man," Jax whispered, his hands shaking as he reached up to rub the neural port behind his ear. "It is screaming today. Ever since those Lumini shiny skins landed, the whole station is humming on a frequency that feels like teeth on a chalkboard. Everyone is on edge. The brass is nervous about the mining contract, the miners are pissed about the shift extensions, and I can feel every single bit of it. It is like 1,000 bees nesting in my skull." I climbed down from the junction box, my boots hitting the grated floor with a heavy clang. I felt nothing. No bees, no hum, no psychic pressure. Just the familiar, comforting roar of the industrial fans and the smell of grease. "Maybe you should try being a flatliner for a day," I said, offering him a dry synthetic protein bar from my pocket. "It is great for the blood pressure. No noise, no drama, just the sweet, sweet sound of your own existential dread." Jax took the bar with a weak smile, but he did not eat it. "Lucky you, Vane. Seriously. Sometimes I think the hegemony sold us a bill of goods with this whole connection thing. They told us we would never be lonely again, but they forgot to mention we would never be alone." I can hear Overseer Graves thinking about his quarterly bonus from 3 decks away, and it is making me want to vomit. I patted his shoulder, a brief gesture of solidarity. "Hang in there, kid. Just focus on the pipes. They do not have feelings." I left him there and headed toward the secondary promenade. I had a requisition form to file, which was the corporate equivalent of shouting into a black hole. But as I reached the main transit lift, the atmosphere shifted. It was not a sound, but a change in the way people were moving. Usually the sump is a place of rhythmic, weary motion, but now it was a frantic swarm. Miners were spilling out of the shafts, their eyes wild and their faces smeared with ore dust. They were not talking, they were shouting, and their mesh lights were flickering in a synchronized violent red. It was a feedback loop. In a society connected by the synaptic mesh, emotions could be contagious. If one person panicked, the person next to them felt that panic, amplified it, and sent it back. In a high-stress environment like the Kalem Spire, a feedback loop was a death sentence. It could turn a minor grievance into a full-scale riot in less than 10 minutes. "Clear the corridor," a security guard screamed, his voice cracking with terror. He was holding a shock prod, but his hands were shaking so hard he looked more likely to tase himself than anyone else. The crowd did not listen. They could not listen. They were caught in a psychic hurricane of their own making. The miners were projecting rage at the guards. The guards were projecting fear at the miners. And the whole thing was spiraling into a catastrophic surge of neural noise. I stood at the edge of the chaos, a silent observer in a world of screaming color. I could see the sweat beads on the guard's forehead. I could see the way the miners were leaning into each other, their minds merging into a single, mindless beast of resentment. And then I saw the Lumini delegation. They were trapped on a skywalk above the promenade, escorted by a dozen frantic corporate suits. Thalen was among them. She was clutching the railing, her face as white as the moonlight skin of her people. Her silver eyes were blown wide, and her long, tapered ears were pinned back against her skull in a gesture of pure, unadulterated agony. To a being who felt everything, this riot was not just a disturbance, it was a physical assault. She was being shredded by the invisible teeth of human rage. My feet moved before my brain could give the order. I did not have a shock prod or a corporate mandate. I only had my silence. I pushed my way into the crowd. People shoved me, cursed at me, but I did not push back. I was a rock in a stream. I reached the center of the fray, where a massive miner named Silas was about to bring a heavy industrial wrench down on the head of a cowering security officer. "Silas!" I yelled, but the sound was swallowed by the roar. I did not stop to think. I reached out and grabbed Silas by his grease-stained shoulder. The moment my skin touched his, something impossible happened. It was not an emotional connection, it was a grounding. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind my ears, a phantom heat where my mesh port was supposed to be. It felt like a massive surge of electricity was pouring into me, looking for a place to go. But there was no circuit. My brain was a dead end. I was a sinkhole for the lightning. The red light on Silas's neck flickered, then dimmed. He blinked, the wild look in his eyes fading as if a fog had suddenly lifted. He looked at me, his breath coming in long, ragged gasps. "Vane?" he whispered, his voice trembling. It stopped. The noise. It just stopped. I did not answer. I kept my hand on his shoulder and reached out for the nearest guard, grabbing his arm. The same thing happened. The guard's panic seemed to drain away, flowing through my body and disappearing into the floor. I was a human lightning rod. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, touching shoulders, grabbing arms, stepping between combatants. Everywhere I touched, the feedback loop broke. The red lights turned to a soft, confused yellow. The shouting died down into a murmur of disorientation. Within 2 minutes, the promenade was silent. Hundreds of people stood there, blinking in the dim neon light, wondering why they had been so ready to kill each other a moment ago. I looked up at the skywalk. Thalen was staring down at me. She had let go of the railing, her ears slowly uncurling. Her expression was not one of gratitude. It was one of absolute, terrifying awe. Beside her, Overseer Graves was staring at me too. But his expression was different. He was not awed. He was calculating. He looked at the miners, then at the guards, then back at me. He looked like a man who had just found a gold mine in his own backyard and was trying to figure out how much it would cost to strip mine it. "Vane," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the new silence. "What the hell did you just do?" I wiped my hands on my jumpsuit, feeling a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. "I am an engineer, Overseer," I said, my voice sounding flat and tired. "I was just fixing a leak." I turned and walked away before he could ask another question. I headed back to the sump, back to my tools and my rusted pipes, but I could feel their eyes on my back. I was no longer a ghost. I was no longer invisible. And in a place like the Calum Spire, being noticed was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a man like me. The high spire was a different universe. Up here, the air was filtered through actual charcoal instead of just desperation, and the walls were lined with living moss that supposedly helped with atmospheric balance, but mostly just looked expensive. It was where the hegemony brass lived, and it was where the Lumini delegation was being housed in a series of suites that cost more per night than I would earn in 3 lifetimes of turning wrenches. I was standing in the middle of a grand ballroom, feeling like a grease stain on a silk sheet. I had been ordered to attend the diplomatic gala, not as a guest, of course, but as a technical standby. Graves had claimed that the station's environmental systems were acting up, but I knew the truth. He wanted me close. He wanted to see if I could repeat the trick from the promenade. "Vane, get a move on," Graves barked, appearing at my side in a suit that was clearly too tight for his ego. "The Lumini are arriving for the dinner. I want you at the perimeter. If the sensors show even a hint of neural resonance fluctuations, you are to stand near the Exarch. Do you understand?" I looked at him, my brow furrowing. "You want me to be a psychic bodyguard?" "Overseer, I am a level 4 systems engineer. My expertise is in atmospheric scrubbers, not xeno-empathic dampening." "You are whatever I tell you to be, Vane," Graves hissed, his face flushing a mottled red. That stunt you pulled in Section 9 saved this station 5 million credits in property damage and at least 22 lawsuits. The hegemony wants to know how you did it, and until they figure it out, you are my most valuable piece of equipment. Now get in position. I walked to the edge of the ballroom, standing near a pillar draped in shimmering blue fabric. I felt the usual itch of the mesh users around me. The room was filled with hundreds of corporate suits, all of them broadcasting a low-frequency hum of ambition, greed, and boredom. To me, it was just a dull pressure behind my eyes. To Illumini, it must have felt like a shark tank. The doors opened and the delegation entered. Thalen was at the lead, her robes a brilliant defensive violet. She looked regal, but as she stepped into the room, I saw her wince. She was hit by a wall of human emotion, so thick you could have carved it with a knife. Every executive in the room was thinking about the mining rights. Every socialite was thinking about her jewelry, and every guard was thinking about his next shift. It was a psychic cacophony. Thalen moved through the crowd with a grace that was clearly forced. She nodded at the dignitaries, her silver eyes scanning the room with a desperate intensity. When she found me, she did not hesitate. She veered away from the main table and walked straight toward my pillar. "Daxen," she said, her voice a low, melodic thrum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Your Majesty," I said, giving a clumsy, half-hearted bow. "I am supposed to be fixing the air conditioning." "The air is fine," she whispered, stepping into the circle of my silence. It was like a physical change. The moment she entered a 3-meter radius of me, her robes shifted from a jagged violet to a soft, peaceful indigo. Her ears relaxed, and the tension in her jaw vanished. "It is the humans that are the problem. They have that effect on people," I agreed, "even on each other." She looked around the room, her eyes filled with a weary sadness. "They are so loud, Daxen. They do not mean to be, perhaps, but their desires are like screams. They want so much. They want the nebula, they want the ore, they want the power. They do not understand that by wanting everything, they are losing themselves." I thought about the miners in the sump. "They want to breathe," I said softly. "They want to go home. They want their kids to grow up without a neural port behind their ears. Is that so wrong?" Thalen looked at me, her expression softening. "No, it is not wrong. But their pain is a fire, and tonight I am made of paper." She stayed there, standing next to me as the evening progressed. To the rest of the room, it looked like a diplomatic gesture, the exarch showing favor to a lowly station engineer. But I knew the truth. I was her shield. I was the only place in the room where she could hear her own heart beating. One of the hegemony investigators, a man named Thorn who looked like he had been carved out of cold flint, approached us. He was holding a diagnostic tablet, his eyes fixed on the neural sensors embedded in the ballroom walls. "Fascinating," Thorn said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The dampening field is not just localized to your person, Mr. Vane. It appears to be an active absorption. The more emotional noise the crowd generates, the more your brain seems to consume it." "Consume it?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. That makes me sound like a parasite. "Not a parasite," Thorn corrected, tapping a button on his tablet. "A filter. You are a biological atmospheric scrubber for the human soul." I looked at Thalen, but she was looking at Thorn. Her ears were pinned back again, her robes flickering with a nervous yellow light. "Is that what I am to you?" I asked Thorn, my voice hardening. "A piece of hardware?" Thorn looked at me, his eyes cold. "You are a resource, Mr. Vane, and resources must be managed. The hegemony has spent centuries trying to perfect the synaptic mesh. We wanted to create a world of total empathy, a world where no one could hide a lie or a secret. But we created a world of noise. You are the mute button. Do you have any idea how much a mute button is worth in a world that never stops screaming?" I felt a sudden, intense surge of anger. It was my own emotion for once, not an echo from the crowd. "I am not a button," I said, stepping closer to him. "And I am not a resource. I am a guy who fixes pipes." "You were a guy who fixed pipes," Thorn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But after tonight, you are the property of the Synaptic Research Division. Your contract is being reassigned. You will be moved to a secure facility on Earth for further testing. I felt a hand on my arm. It was Thallon. She was looking at Thorn with a cold, regal fury that I had never seen before. Callan Voss is under the protection of the seventh house of the Lumini, she said, her voice ringing out across the ballroom. The music stopped. The executives turned. Even Graves looked frozen in place. Thorn did not blink. With all due respect, Exarch, Mr. Vane is a human citizen of the hegemony. Your diplomatic immunity does not extend to our personnel. He is not personnel, Thallon said, her robes turning a brilliant, defiant red. He is a guest of my house. And I have just granted him sanctuary in the Veil Nebula. The room erupted in a murmur of shocked voices. Sanctuary? In the nebula? No human had ever been granted sanctuary by the Lumini. It was a breach of protocol so massive it threatened to derail the entire mining treaty. I looked at Thallon, my mind reeling. You can't be serious, I whispered. You want me to go to the nebula? She looked at me, her silver eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea. I cannot leave you here, Daxen. They will break you to find the secret of your silence. And I cannot lose the only place in the universe where I am not drowning. I looked at Thorn, who was already speaking into a comms unit, likely calling for security. I looked at Graves, who was hyperventilating into a silk handkerchief. And then I looked at my grease-stained hands. I had spent 32 years believing I was a glitch. I had spent my whole life trying to be more like everyone else, trying to feel the hum, trying to be part of the swarm. I had hated my silence because I thought it was a wall that kept the world out. But as I stood there in the middle of that expensive, screaming ballroom, I realized the truth. My silence was not a wall, it was a harbor. And for a woman who was drowning in the emotions of 1,000 souls, it was the only thing that mattered. I am in, I said, my voice steady. Thorn looked at me, his expression turning to one of pure corporate malice. You are making a mistake, Vane. You cannot outrun the hegemony. Maybe not, I said, reaching for my toolkit and feeling the familiar weight of my heavy wrench. But I can sure as hell make it quiet while I try. Thallon grabbed my hand. Her skin was cool, but the warmth I felt was something more than biological. It was a choice. Let's bug out, I said, using a bit of street slang I had picked up in the sump. We turned and ran, not toward the lifts, but toward the maintenance shafts I knew better than anyone on the station. Behind us, I heard the shouting of security guards and the frantic commands of Overseer Graves. But as we dove into the dark, narrow tunnels of the spire, the noise began to fade. The deeper we went into the guts of the station, the more the silence returned. It was just the two of us, a level 4 engineer and a Galactic queen, running through the steam and the rust. We reached the private hangar where the Lumini needle ship was docked. It was a sleek, silver thing that looked like it had been carved from a single diamond. The guards at the ramp were already in position, their ears twitching in a way that I now knew meant readiness. Halt! A voice screamed from the far end of the hangar. It was Thorn, flanked by 4 security officers with heavy pulse rifles. They were 50 meters away, closing fast. Get on the ship! I yelled at Thallon, pushing her toward the ramp. What about you? She cried, her robes flickering with a frantic orange fear. I am right behind you, I said. I just have to close the door. I turned back to the pursuit. Thorn was raising his rifle. He was not aiming for my head. He was aiming for my legs. He wanted me alive. He wanted his resource. I closed my eyes. I did not reach for a weapon. I reached for the void. I opened the gates of my mind, wider than I had ever dared before. I did not just absorb the noise around me. I projected the absolute, terrifying stillness of my own soul. It was a shockwave of nothingness. I saw the security guards stumble. Their mesh lights, which had been a disciplined, tactical blue, suddenly flared a blinding white and then went out. They dropped their rifles, clutching their heads as they were hit by a vacuum of emotion. To them, it must have felt like the stars had suddenly been extinguished. Thorn fell to his knees, his face a mask of vacant horror. He was not in pain. He was just nowhere. I did not wait to see if they would recover. I turned and scrambled up the ramp of the needle ship. The airlock hissed shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the Calum spire forever. I collapsed against the smooth silver wall, my chest heaving, my mind reeling from the effort. I felt a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," Thalyn whispered, her eyes shining with tears. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. "I am just an engineer," I croaked. "I was just closing the door." She pulled me into a hug, her robes turning a soft, golden yellow. "No, Daxen, you were being the harbor." The ship's engines hummed, a deep melodic sound that did not hurt my head. I felt the sudden, stomach-churning pull of a quantum fold jump. We were leaving the hegemony. We were leaving the noise. I looked through the viewport as the Calum spire shrunk into a tiny, rusted needle against the green storms of Ignis 7. For 32 years, I had been a ghost in that machine. I had been a defect, a glitch, a man with a broken heart. But as the stars blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors I would never feel, I realized that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was Kalen Voss. I was the Void Echo. And for the first time in my life, I was not alone in the quiet. The journey to the Veil Nebula would take 6 days. 6 days of peace, 6 days of silence. And as I looked at the alien queen sitting beside me, I realized that I did not mind the leaks in the universe anymore. I was an engineer, after all, and I had a whole new world of things to fix. The journey through the Veil Nebula was not like traveling through a vacuum. It felt more like being swallowed by a giant, bioluminescent jellyfish. Outside the reinforced viewports of the Silken Shard, the universe was no longer a cold black canvas. It was a riot of ionized gases, neon purples, electric blues, and a shade of gold that looked like molten honey. It was beautiful, sure, but as an engineer, all I could think about was what those charged particles were doing to our exterior hull plating. "How are the sensors holding up?" I asked, my voice echoing in the bridge of the ship. The bridge did not have the cluttered utilitarian feel of a hegemony vessel. There were no banks of flickering monitors or tangled cables. Instead, the room was a smooth, curving amphitheater of translucent pearl. In the center sat a single pulsing crystal the size of a human torso. Thalen stood before it, her hands hovering inches from its surface, her fingers moving as if she were playing an invisible harp. "The shard is breathing, Daxen," she murmured, not looking back. Her Aegis silk robes were a soft, rhythmic green, reflecting the calm of the jump. "It feels the nebula. It knows the way home." "Right. It breathes." "Great," I muttered, leaning against a bulkhead that felt more like warm bone than cold steel. I was currently nursing a headache that felt like a miniature supernova was trying to expand behind my eyes. Projecting that void field back at the station had taken a toll I had not expected. It was one thing to be a quiet room. It was another to turn into a vacuum and try to suck the air out of an entire hangar. I felt thin, like a piece of parchment that had been stretched too far. For 32 years, I had treated my silence as a passive defect, a biological shrug from the universe. But now it felt like a muscle I had never known I had, and I had just pulled it. "You should rest," Thalyn said, finally turning to look at me. Her silver eyes were filled with a concern that made my stomach do a slow, dizzying roll. "You gave too much of yourself to save us." "I am fine," I lied, pushing off the wall. My boots made a heavy, dull sound on the floor, a stark contrast to the fluid, silent grace of the Lumini crew members who were moving through the corridors below us. "I am just a bit rust-gnawed. Nothing a bit of synthetic coffee and 5 hours of staring at a wall won't fix." I walked over to a small alcove that served as a diagnostic station, or at least as close to one as this overgrown crystal ship could manage. I pulled a handheld scanner from my utility belt, a piece of hegemony tech that looked like a prehistoric club in this room of light. "You know, the brass back on the spire are probably having a collective stroke right about now," I said, trying to steer the conversation towards something less personal. "You did not just steal a level 4 engineer. You basically declared that the Lumini are willing to flip the bird at the most powerful corporation in the sector for the sake of a guy who fixes toilets." Thalyn stepped toward me, her presence bringing that familiar, cooling hush. The screaming of the ship's engines, which I could feel as a low-frequency vibration in my teeth, seemed to settle into a hum. "It was not for the sake of an engineer," she said softly. "It was for the sake of our future. My people are dying, Daxen." I stopped fiddling with my scanner and looked at her. Dying? You guys look pretty vibrant to me. You live in palaces of light and eat stardust. What is the catch? Connection is our strength, but it is also our poison, she explained, her robes shifting to a somber, muted gray. For thousands of years we have lived as one. We share every joy, every discovery, every memory. But as our population grew, as the universe became louder, the resonance became a weight. We are like a song that is being played too loud for too long. The feedback is beginning to tear us apart. We call it the resonant decay. Our elders lose themselves in the collective. They forget where they end and the next person begins. They become shells, babbling the memories of 1,000 ancestors. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental settings. That sounds like a nightmare. It is, she said, and that is why you are so important. Your mind is the first place I have ever found where the song stops. You are a silence that does not destroy, but heals. I looked down at my hands. They were rough, scarred by years of labor on the spire. My knuckles were stained with old grease that no sonic shower would ever fully remove. I was a man of bolts and circuits, of physical realities and hard limits. I did not belong in a world of metaphors and soul songs. I am just an engineer, Thalen, I said, my voice sounding more tired than I intended. I fix things that leak. I am not a savior. I am not a biological mute button. I am just a guy who wants to be able to walk down a hallway without having a panic attack because someone else is having a bad day. She reached out, her fingers brushing my wrist. We want the same thing, Daxen Vane. The next 3 days were a blur of nebula glow and alien architecture. As we neared the heart of the veil, the shard began to slow. We passed through a field of crystalline asteroids that sang as the ship's wake hit them, a haunting, multi-tonal melody that I could actually hear with my ears. And then we saw it. Vioris Prime. It was not a planet of rock and dirt. It was a jewel. Massive, slender spires of white stone and translucent glass grew from the mountains like frozen lightning. There were no roads, only bridges of pure light that connected the peaks. The oceans were not blue, but a brilliant, glowing turquoise that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it terrified me. We landed at the Sovereign Spire, the tallest of the mountain peaks. As the airlock hissed open, I was hit by a scent that made my lungs ache with its purity. Frozen earth, wild honey, and something that smelled like the very beginning of the world. There was a welcoming party, of course. Thousands of lumini were gathered in the plaza, their aegis silk robes a chaotic, vibrating sea of colors. The moment Thalen stepped onto the ramp, a wave of silver and gold, reverence and joy, swept through the crowd. I could feel it even without the mesh, a physical pressure of collective emotion that made the air feel thick. I followed her down the ramp, my heavy boots clanking on the crystalline floor. The moment I stepped onto the plaza, the hush began. It started with the people closest to me, their robes suddenly smoothing out into a calm, steady blue. The ripple of silence spread outward like a stone dropped into a pond. Within seconds, the thousands of frantic, shimmering voices had been replaced by an absolute, breathtaking quiet. They stood there, thousands of them, staring at me. They were not looking at a hero. They were looking at a void, a hole in their world. Kalen Voss, a voice boomed, vibrating directly in the bones of my chest. An elder stepped forward from the crowd. He was taller than Thalen, his skin almost completely transparent, his ears so long they curved back like the horns of an ancient beast. His robes were a deep, smoking black, threaded with veins of angry red. This was Voris, the High Counselor of the Seventh House. "You have brought a null into our sanctuary, Exarch," Voris vibrated, his robes flaring with a jagged orange skepticism. "He is not a null, Counselor," Thalen replied, her voice ringing out with a royal authority that made the crowd bow their heads. "He is the guest of the Sovereign, and he is the answer to the decay." Voris walked toward me, his silver eyes narrowing as he entered my field. I saw him flinch. His robes flickered as the static of my mind hit his senses. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and fascination, the way an art critic might look at a smudge of dirt on a masterpiece. "He is a glitch," Voris said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "A regression to the state of the beast? You think to save us by making us deaf? I think to save us by giving us a choice, Thalon snapped. I stood there, my hands stuffed into my pockets, feeling like a side of beef at a butcher's auction. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was the most important thing in the room, and all I wanted was to find a dark corner and a heavy wrench. Look, counselor, I said, my voice sounding flat and harsh in the crystalline silence. I did not ask to be here. Your exarch practically hijacked me from my job. If you want me to leave, just point me to the nearest shuttle. I am sure the hegemony will be happy to have their property back. Voris paused, his robes settling into a cautious, watchful yellow. You would return to the people who wish to dismantle your brain for spare parts? I have spent my whole life being dismantled, I said, a bitter edge creeping into my voice. One way or another, people always want to use the silence. They just can't agree on what to call it. Thalene stepped between us, her robes a shimmering, protective indigo. Daxen is exhausted. He will be housed in the inner spire. We will reconvene the council tomorrow. Voris gave a stiff, formal bow, but his eyes never left mine. As I followed Thalon toward the palace, I could feel the thousands of lumini watching me. They were not silent because they were at peace. They were silent because they were waiting. And as the suns of Viorus Prime began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the mountains, I realized that the noise of the Kalem spire was nothing compared to the weight of 1,000 people hoping you were the miracle they had been praying for. The inner spire was a gilded cage. If the cage was made of living light and the bars were made of perfect, suffocating hospitality. My quarters were a massive circular chamber with a floor that looked like a deep space nebula and a ceiling that shifted colors based on my mood, which meant it was currently a dark, stormy gray. I had spent most of the morning trying to figure out how to work the shower. It turned out that the lumini did not use water. They used ultrasonic resonance to vibrate the dirt off your skin. It was efficient, sure, but it lacked the honest, skin-scouring satisfaction of a hot spray. I felt clean, but I still felt like I was wearing a layer of someone else's expectations. A soft chime echoed through the room, followed by the hiss of the door sliding open. It was Thalon. She was not wearing her formal robes today. She was in a simple gray tunic that made her look smaller, more fragile. The council has reached a decision, she said, her voice sounding strained. I sat on the edge of the floating bed, my boots already laced up. I am guessing it does not involve me getting a quiet corner in the maintenance department. She walked over to the viewport, her back to me. They want to initiate the link, Daxen. The link? I asked, a knot of apprehension forming in my chest. You mean like the mesh? Not like the mesh, she said, turning to face me. The mesh is a network of echoes. The link is a permanent bridge. They want to connect your mind to the great resonance of the veil. They believe that if your void is at the center of our network, it will act as a permanent stabilizer. It would stop the decay for everyone. And what would it do to me? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Thalon looked away. We do not know. No human has ever been at the heart of the resonance. The volume of data, the sheer weight of 1 billion souls sharing a single mind. It would erase me, I said. It was not a question. It was a statement of engineering fact. You are talking about plugging a 100-watt bulb into a fusion reactor. The bulb doesn't stay a bulb, Thalon. It just becomes a flash of light before it burns out. Voris believes a sacrifice is necessary, she whispered. He says that the life of one human is a small price to pay for the survival of the Lumini race. I stood up, the anger I had been suppressing for days finally boiling over. And what do you say, Exarch? Is that why you brought me here? To be a biological filter? To be the guy who sits in a crystal chair until his brain turns into mush so your people can keep singing their soul songs? No, she cried, stepping toward me, her robes flaring a frantic, desperate orange. I brought you here because I wanted you to be safe. I thought that if they saw what you could do, they would understand that you are a person, not a tool. Well, they saw what I could do, I spat. And they decided I am a tool, just like the hegemony did, just like Graves did. The only difference is that you guys use prettier words for it. I grabbed my toolkit from the floor, the heavy weight of the metal familiar and grounding. I am leaving, Thalon. I don't care if I have to steal a shuttle or walk through the nebula. I am not being anyone's spare part. You cannot leave, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure terror. Vorus has already moved the security details. The spire is locked down. They are coming for you at 1800 hours. I checked my chronometer. It was 1715 hours. I had 45 minutes before I became a permanent piece of Lumini infrastructure. I looked at Thalon. She was standing there, the queen of the nebula, looking like a lost child. Her people were dying, and I was the cure. But the cure would kill me. It was the ultimate trolley problem, and I was the guy tied to the tracks. Help me, I said. She blinked, her silver eyes shimmering with unshed tears. What? Help me get to the hangar, I said. If you truly want me to be more than a tool, then prove it. Give me my life back. She hesitated, her robes shifting through a dozen different shades of conflict. If I help you, I am betraying my house. I am sentencing my people to the decay. And if you don't help me, you are a murderer, I said, stepping into her space. You told me the gift was in the space between. You told me my silence was a harbor. Is this how you treat a harbor? By filling it with so much noise that it ceases to exist? The silence between us stretched out, heavy and cold. I could feel the station, the spire, vibrating with the anticipation of the council. They were already preparing the crystal, already tuning the resonance. I could feel the low-frequency hum of it in the marrow of my bones. Thalon took a deep breath. Her robe settled into a hard, crystalline white, the color of absolute resolve. Follow me, she said. We moved through the back corridors of the spire, the maintenance tunnels that the Lumini rarely used. These were older than the white stone above, carved from the raw crystal of the mountain. The air here was colder, and the light was dim. We reached the secondary hangar, a wide, vaulted chamber filled with smaller scout ships. I could see my shuttle, the Silken Shard, docked at the far end. But there were guards, 4 Lumini warriors in Aegis silk armor, their long pikes glowing with a deadly blue energy. I can't take them, I whispered, crouching behind a crystalline outcropping. They'll feel me coming from a mile away. Then don't be a ghost, Thalon said, her eyes fixed on the guards. Be the void. I looked at her. What? Use the field, Daxen, not as a shield, but as a weapon. Reach out and take their noise. Take their connection. If they cannot feel each other, they cannot fight. I closed my eyes. I thought about the sump. I thought about the screaming miners and the shaking guards. I thought about the darkness inside my own head, the quiet room I had spent 32 years building. I didn't reach for my anger. I reached for my emptiness. I pushed my mind outward, expanding the borders of my silence until it touched the guards. I felt their resonance, a 4-part harmony of discipline and duty. It was a beautiful song. I swallowed it. I pulled the harmony into the vacuum of my mind. I watched as the guards' robes turned a dull, lifeless gray. They stumbled, their pikes falling from their hands as they were hit by a wave of absolute isolation. They weren't in pain, they were just alone. For a Lumini, being alone was a death of the soul. They collapsed to their knees, their ears pinning back, their eyes wide with a terror that they couldn't even share with each other. Go. Thalon hissed. We ran across the hangar floor, our feet echoing in the silence. We reached the ramp of the shard. I punched the manual override, the airlock hissing open with a sound of pure, beautiful engineering. I turned to look at Thalon. Come with me. She stood at the bottom of the ramp, her robes flickering with a soft, mournful indigo. I cannot, Daxen. I am the Exarch. If I leave, there will be no one to stand against Vorus. There will be no one to protect the others like you. Others like me? I asked, my hand on the airlock door. You mean there are more? The decay is creating them, she said. Children born without the song. Vorus calls them broken. I call them the future. I have to stay to make sure they are not turned into tools. I looked at her, and for the first time I realized the cost of her crown. She was staying in the storm so that others could find the harbor. You're a hell of a queen, Thalon, I said, my voice thick. And you're a hell of an engineer, Daxen Vane, she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. Now bug out, before the council figures out how to sing in the dark. I dove into the cockpit, my fingers flying over the controls. I didn't need a Lumini crystal to fly this ship. I had rewritten the navigation code on the way here. I was an engineer. I knew how to make things move. The engines roared to life, a deep, physical thrum that felt like home. The hangar doors began to cycle open, revealing the iridescent clouds of the Vale Nebula. I looked down at the ramp one last time. Thelene was standing there, a small figure of light in a mountain of crystal. She raised her hand in a silent farewell. I slammed the throttle forward. The silken shards shot out of the hangar like a bolt of lightning. I didn't look back at the spire. I didn't look back at the singing mountains. I focused on the nebula, on the gold and purple gases that were waiting to swallow me. I was 32 years old and I was a fugitive from two different empires. I had no credits, no home, and a brain that was essentially a biological weapon. But as the ship jumped into a quantum fold and the silence of deep space settled over me, I realized something important. I wasn't empty. I was just getting started. I had a nebula to hide in. I had a universe to fix. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the quiet. I was the master of it. Drifting in the Vale Nebula is like being a single dust mote in a bottle of swirling, glowing ink. For 48 hours, I had been running the silken shard on a ghost profile, keeping the power draw to a minimum and the heat signatures masked. The nebula gases, mostly ionized hydrogen and a fair amount of what I suspected was sentient stardust, acted as a natural dampener for hegemony long-range scans. But even with the nebula's help, I felt like a man standing in a dark room holding a lit candle, waiting for the shadows to notice me. The shard's interior light had settled into a dim, mournful charcoal. Without Thalin's hands on the central crystal, the ship felt cold. It was still breathing. I could hear the rhythmic pulse of the life support baffles in the walls, but it was the breath of a person in a coma. I spent most of my time in the engine crawl space, surrounded by the only things that made sense to me: conduits, thermal couplers, and the honest, unfeeling logic of a failing fusion core. I was currently trying to bypass a scorched relay in the secondary navigation array. The Lumini tech was elegant, sure, but it was a nightmare to repair with human tools. Every time I touched a crystal fiber with my magnetic wrench, the ship let out a low, vibrating hum of protest. "Keep your hair on, you oversized paperweight," I muttered, wiping a glob of translucent cooling fluid from my chin. "I am just trying to make sure we don't drift into a gravity well and turn into a very expensive pancake." I reached for my scanner, but my hand stopped midair. The silence in my head, my constant, lifelong companion, suddenly felt heavy. It was the same sensation I'd felt back on the Calum Spire, right before the riot. A pressure against the back of my skull, like a storm front moving in. But there were no humans here, no Lumini, just me and a few 100,000 light years of nothing. The ship's proximity alarm didn't scream. It sang, a low, haunting cello note that vibrated through the floorboards. I scrambled out of the crawl space, my boots clattering against the deck, and made it to the bridge just in time to see a massive shadow loom out of the purple gas. It wasn't a ship. Not a modern one, anyway. It was a jagged, obsidian-colored asteroid, roughly 6 kilometers long, with a sprawling network of rusted metal scaffolds and flickering habitation domes clinging to its surface like barnacles. It looked like a graveyard for every failed industrial project in the sector. The scanner on my belt chirped. It was a low-frequency human broadcast signal, primitive, encrypted with a code that was at least 20 years out of date. "This is Obsidian Reach. All vessels clear the approach. We do not have credits. We do not have ore. We only have the quiet." The quiet. I hesitated. Every survival instinct I had honed in the sump told me to bug out. Hidden outposts in the Vale were usually populated by pirates, deserters, or people who had very good reasons for not being found. But the shard's fuel cells were sitting at 15%, and the cooling leak was getting worse. If I didn't find a dock soon, I was going to be the quietest corpse in the nebula. I nudged the controls, bringing the shard toward a jagged docking arm that looked like it might snap if I sneezed. The airlock hissed open with a groan of metal that sounded like a dying beast. I grabbed my toolkit and a heavy-duty plasma cutter, not exactly a diplomat's weapon, but it made me feel better, and stepped out onto the reach. The air was thin, smelling of stale recycled oxygen and scorched copper. The lighting was a flickering, sickly amber. As I walked down the primary corridor, I didn't see any guards. I didn't see any corporate logos. I saw people. They were a mess. A mix of humans in tattered jumpsuits and lumini whose translucent skin had turned a dull, matte gray. They were sitting in the shadows, leaning against the rusted walls. But as I passed, none of them looked up. None of them broadcasted that sharp, stinging needle of curiosity or fear that I was so used to. They were all nulls. Vane? I spun around, my plasma cutter halfway out of its holster. Standing in the doorway of a dimly lit workshop was a man who looked like he had been put through a trash compactor and then poorly reassembled. He was probably 60 years old with a prosthetic arm made of salvaged mining parts and a face that was more scar tissue than skin. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Who are you?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "And how do you know my name?" "Name's Marlowe," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "And I don't know your name, Scug. I just recognize the look. You're a flatliner, a void echo, whatever the brass is calling it these days. We get a lot of your kind out here, or we used to, before the hegemony started rounding you up for the labs." I lowered the cutter, my shoulders sagging. "You're a human, on an alien rock, in the middle of nowhere. Best place to be if you want to keep your brains from leaking out your ears," Marlowe said, gesturing for me to follow him into the workshop. "This is the Reach. We're the ones the universe forgot to plug in." The workshop was a chaotic paradise of salvaged tech. I saw parts from hegemony threshers, lumini needles, and things I didn't even recognize. In the corner, a young lumini girl, maybe 18 years old, was painstakingly soldering a circuit board. Her robes were a dead, motionless charcoal. She didn't even flinch as I entered. "That's Alara," Marlowe said, his voice softening. "She was born on Vioris Prime. Her parents realized she was a null when she was 3. They smuggled her out here before the council could turn her into a stabilizer." I looked at the girl. She looked peaceful, but it was a fragile peace. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're flying an Exarch ship, kid, and because the resonance storm is coming." Marlowe sat down on a crate, his mechanical arm whirring as he gestured toward a monitor. "We've been picking up signals from the inner veil. The hegemony and the Lumine Council, they've made a deal." "A deal?" I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. "Thalen would never—" "Not the Exarch," Marlowe interrupted. "Vorus. He's tired of waiting for the decay to take his people. He's teamed up with your friend Thorn. They're building something. They call it the Resonance Spike. It's a broadcast array designed to force a connection across the entire nebula. They think if they can just hit everyone with enough power, they can jumpstart the resonance and burn out the decay." "And the nulls?" I asked. "We're the test subjects," Marlowe said, his eyes hard as flint. "A broadcast that powerful? It'll hit a null like a physical blow. It'll fry our synapses before the connection even takes. They're testing the first stage tonight, on us." I looked at Alara, then back at the rusted corridors of the Reach. Thousands of people, thousands of ghosts. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked. "Where to?" Marlowe laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "We're defects, Vane. We're the glitches in the hardware. Nobody wants a part that doesn't fit. So we stay here, and we wait for the brass to decide we're worth more as scrap than as people." I felt a surge of familiar anger, but beneath it, there was something else, a realization. All my life, I had thought of my silence as a flaw I had to hide. I had spent 32 years trying to be a real human, trying to find a way to make the noise stop being so loud. But looking at Alara, I realized that the noise wasn't the problem. The problem was the people who thought they had the right to turn it up. "I'm an engineer," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I don't believe in miracles, but I do believe in grounding wires." Marlowe looked at me, a glimmer of interest in his old eyes. "What are you thinking, kid?" "I'm thinking that the silken shard has a central amplification crystal the size of a human torso," I said, reaching for my toolkit. "And I'm thinking that if I can wire my own brain directly into the ship's transmission array, I can turn this whole asteroid into a dead zone." Marlowe stood up, his mechanical arm clenching. That would kill you, Vane. The volume of the spike. You'd be trying to catch a tidal wave in a bucket. I've spent my whole life being a bucket, Marlowe, I said, heading for the door. It's time I started choosing what I catch. The air in the Silken Shards Bridge was freezing. I had cut the life support to 50% to divert every spare watt of power to the central crystal. Marlowe was down in the Reach's primary power core, trying to bridge the gap between human fusion and Lumini resonance. Ilara was sitting on the floor next to me, her hand resting on my boot. She couldn't speak to me through the mesh, but her presence was a quiet, steady weight. You don't have to do this, Daxen, a voice whispered in my head. It wasn't a neural broadcast. It was a memory. Thalin's voice from that first night in my cabin. You are the space between. You are the most precious thing I have ever found in the dark. I am an engineer, I whispered to the empty bridge, and I have a job to do. I had stripped the casing from the central crystal, exposing the raw, pulsing heart of the ship. I had used my magnetic wrench to forge a series of crude silver wire electrodes. One end was buried in the crystal. The other was taped to the skin behind my left ear, right over the dead mesh port. It was a clunker's solution, ugly, dangerous, and likely to explode. But it was the only circuit I had. Daxen, are you ready? Marlowe's voice crackled over the ship's comms. The spike is charging. I can feel it in the hull. It's a heavy hum, kid, like a swarm of hornets the size of shuttles. Copy that, Marlowe, I said, my fingers hovering over the final activation sequence. Just keep the juice flowing. If I blow a fuse, this whole rock is going to turn into a psychic toaster. I looked out the viewport. The nebula was churning, the purple and gold gases being sucked toward a central point a few light years away. I could see the silhouette of a hegemony thresher, and beside it, a Lumini spire ship. They were tethered together by a beam of pure, blinding white light, the resonant spike. I took a deep breath. My heart was thumping, a rhythmic, terrified beat against my ribs. I thought about Earth. I thought about the smell of salt water and the sound of wind in real trees. I thought about all the things I had wanted to be and all the ways I had felt like I was failing at being a person. I wasn't a broken radio. I was the silence that let the music make sense. I pushed the lever. The first hit was like being struck by a freighter. The spike's broadcast wasn't a sound. It was a wall of pure, unadulterated need. It was the collective hunger of the hegemony and the desperate, dying screams of the Lumini elders, all amplified 1,000,000 times and funneled into a single beam. It hit the Reach like a physical blow. I saw the domes on the asteroid flare a violent, jagged red. Through the ship's sensors, I heard the screams of 1,000 nulls as their minds were forcibly pried open by the light. And then it hit me. The noise flooded through the electrodes, bypassing my senses and pouring directly into the void of my mind. It was a hurricane of static, a roaring fire of other people's memories, fears, and greed. Profit margins, the mining rights, save the children, don't let the song end, kill the glitches. I screamed, my body racking with a seizure that threw me against the bridge console. My vision went white. I felt the skin behind my ear beginning to blister. The crystal in front of me turned a scorched, angry orange, spiderweb cracks spreading across its surface. You are empty, the noise hissed in my brain. You are a hole. You are nothing. Give up. Let the light in. I clenched my teeth, my jaw aching from the pressure. I reached out with my mind, not to fight the noise, but to embrace it. I am a sinkhole, I thought. The words a cold, hard iron in the middle of the storm, and I am very, very hungry. I opened the gates. I didn't just absorb the spike, I pulled it. I turned the silken shard into a vacuum of absolute stillness. I felt the noise flowing into me, hitting the bottom of my void and simply vanishing. I was a human grounding wire, and I was taking the lightning of 2 empires and burying it in the dark. The bridge began to glow with a soft obsidian light. The screaming in the corridors of the Reach died down. I saw Ilara on the floor. She had closed her eyes, her robes turning a peaceful, steady emerald. I pushed harder. I followed the spike's beam back to its source. I reached across the light years, past the thresher, past the spire ship, and I found the man at the controls. Thorn. I didn't send him a message. I didn't send him a threat. I just showed him what it was like to be me. I showed him the absolute terrifying peace of a mind that doesn't echo. I showed him the vast, cold beauty of the space between the stars. I showed him that the noise he was so desperate to control was nothing compared to the power of a single soul that is content to be quiet. I felt Thorn's mind buckle. It wasn't a violent break. It was a sudden, overwhelming realization of his own insignificance. On the monitor, I saw the Thresher's broadcast beam flicker, then shatter into a million harmless sparks. The resonant spike was dead. I slumped forward, the electrodes tearing away from my skin with a sharp sting. The bridge went dark. The only sound was the heavy, ragged sound of my own breathing and the soft hum of the ship's failing fusion core. Daxen? Marlowe's voice was a whisper in the dark. Daxen, talk to me, kid. I'm here, I croaked, my throat feeling like I had swallowed a handful of hot coals. I'm okay. You did it, Vane, Marlowe said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The spike is gone. The reach is quiet. Everyone? They're all breathing again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was staring at my hands in the dim light. They were still shaking. I still had grease under my fingernails. I was still a level 4 engineer with a dud mesh port and a 32-year history of being a social pariah. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mistake. I felt like a masterpiece. I had used my flaw to save 1,000 ghosts. I had turned my empty mind into a sanctuary for the people the universe had tried to throw away. I hadn't fixed my defect. I had finally found out what it was designed for. The airlock hissed open. Thalen stepped onto the bridge. She wasn't wearing her royal robes. She was covered in soot, her tunic torn, her silver eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. She had stolen a scout ship and flown through the aftermath of the spike to find me. Daxen, she said, her voice a fragile, beautiful thing. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I am sorry about your ship, I said, gesturing toward the cracked crystal. I think I blew a fuse. She didn't care about the ship. She crossed the bridge in 3 strides and pulled me into a hug that nearly knocked the wind out of me. Her robes were a brilliant, shimmering gold, the color of pure, unadulterated relief. You stayed, she whispered into my neck. You didn't run. I'm an engineer, Thalen, I said, my arms finding their way around her. I can't leave a job half-finished. She pulled back, her silver eyes searching mine. Vorus is gone. When the spike failed, the council saw what he had become. They saw the greed. My people, they are waking up, Daxen. They are realizing that the noise isn't the only way to live. I looked at Alara, who was standing by the viewport, watching the nebula settle back into its purple glow. I looked at Marlowe, who was stepping onto the bridge with a wide, toothless grin. What happens now? I asked. Now, Thalen said, taking my hand and interlacing her fingers with mine. We build something new, not a hive, not a swarm, but a home. A place where the song can be heard, but where the silence is always welcome. I looked out at the Veil Nebula. It was still vast, still leaky, and still a poorly maintained piece of hardware. But as I stood there with the Queen of the Nebula on one side and a tattered collection of ghosts on the other, I realized that I didn't mind the repairs. I was an engineer after all, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The universe wasn't broken. It was just waiting for someone to stop screaming long enough to fix it. The aftermath of a psychic explosion does not look like a battlefield. There are no craters, no smoking ruins, and no twisted metal, at least not on the surface. But as I sat on the edge of the Silken Shard's ruined bridge, the silence that filled the obsidian reach felt heavier than any rubble. It was a thick, syrupy quiet that made my ears ring. I felt like I had been hollowed out with a rusty spoon. My head was a cavern of dry echoes, and every time I blinked, I saw the afterimage of Thorn's face. The moment he realized that the nothing inside me was stronger than all the everything he had tried to build. My left ear was throbbing with a rhythmic, pulsing heat. I reached up and felt the charred skin where the electrodes had been. It was a nasty burn, a jagged souvenir of the time I decided to play grounding wire for 2 intergalactic empires. Don't touch it, Scug. You'll just make it angry. Marlowe was standing in the doorway, his mechanical arm whirring as he adjusted the settings on a medical scanner. He looked like he'd been dragged through a gravel pit, but his eyes were brighter than I had ever seen them. He walked over and pressed a cool antiseptic patch against the side of my head. I winced, the sting sharp enough to bring tears to my eyes. "Quit your belly aching," Marlowe grunted, though his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You just absorbed enough neural energy to fry a medium-sized moon. A bit of a singe is a bargain, considering your brain didn't turn into lukewarm oatmeal." "How is the reach?" I asked, my voice sounding like it had been filtered through a handful of sand. The old man sat down on a crate, leaning his head back against the shimmering pearl wall. "The reach is different. For the first time in 20 years, the air doesn't feel like it's vibrating. The nulls, human and lumini alike, they're waking up. It's like they were all holding their breath for a lifetime and finally found out how to let it out. You didn't just break the spike vein, you gave them a perimeter, a space where they don't have to be afraid of being seen." I looked out the viewport. The hegemony thresher was still out there, but it was drifting, its engines dark. The Lumini spire ship was likewise silent, tethered to the human vessel like a pair of abandoned toys. They weren't destroyed, but they were broken in a way that had nothing to do with hardware. "What about Thorn?" I asked. Marlowe snorted, a dry, rattling sound. "Last we heard, the hegemony was hauling him back to Earth in a stasis pod. Seems your little invitation to the void left him a bit unresponsive. He's not brain dead, but he's not exactly the corporate shark he used to be. He's just quiet. For a man like that, it's probably a fate worse than death." I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel anything except a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent in the sump, fixing pipes and dodging the brass, thinking that if I could just stay invisible long enough, the world would eventually leave me alone. I had spent 32 years running from the nothing inside me, only to find out that it was the only thing I had that was worth keeping. A soft chime echoed through the bridge, and Thalen stepped inside. She had cleaned herself up, her robes a shimmering, translucent silver that seemed to catch the dying light of the nebula. She looked at me, and for the first time she didn't look like an exarch. She looked like a friend. "The Council of the Seventh House has officially dissolved," she said, her voice a low melodic thrum. "Vorus has fled into the inner veil. He knew the resonance would never be the same after what you did. My people, they are beginning to understand. The song was never meant to be a cage." I looked at my hands, still stained with the silver wire residue and the grease of the reach. "So what now?" "I'm still a fugitive, Thalen. The hegemony doesn't like losing its resources, and I'm pretty sure I'm at the top of their most wanted list for causing a sector-wide blackout." Thalen walked over and sat on the floor next to me, her hand resting on my knee. "Let them come," she said simply. "They cannot find a shadow in a storm. The veil is vast, Daxen, and you are the one who knows how to navigate the dark." I looked at Alara, who was standing by the central crystal, her hand gently tracing the spiderweb cracks I had made. She wasn't holding her head anymore. She wasn't cowering in the shadows, she was just being. It was a strange thing to witness. In a universe where everyone was trying to be something, a brand, a profile, a resonance, a leader, these people were content to be nothing. And in that nothingness, they had found a peace that the rest of the galaxy was literally dying to achieve. "You know," I said, looking at Marlowe, "I used to hate the silence. I thought it was a defect, a glitch in the system that made me less than human." Marlowe stood up, his mechanical arm whirring as he packed his medical kit. "We all have glitches, kid. The universe is a clunker, remember? The trick isn't fixing the glitch. The trick is figuring out that the glitch is the only part of the machine that actually works the way it's supposed to." He walked toward the door, then paused, looking back at me. "You saved a lot of ghosts today, Vane. Don't go becoming one yourself." I watched him go, then turned my gaze back to the nebula. The gold and purple gases were settling, the violent churning replaced by a slow, majestic swirl. I felt the familiar weight of the silence in my head, but it didn't feel like a wall anymore. It felt like a foundation. "I'm an engineer," I whispered to the quiet bridge, "and I've got a hell of a lot of work to do." Thallin smiled, her robes turning a soft, golden yellow. Then let's get started, Daxen Vane. The reach is leaky, the engines are failing, and I believe we have a whole new world of things to fix. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cool, but the connection was solid. It wasn't a neural link. It wasn't a psychic echo. It was just two people, sitting in a room, holding on to each other while the world outside continued to scream. And for the first time in 32 years, that was more than enough. 3 months have passed since I turned myself into a human lightning rod and blew a hole in the hegemony's ego. The Obsidian Reach doesn't look like a graveyard anymore. It looks like a workshop. We've been busy. Marlowe, Ilara, Thallin, and a few hundred other nulls who found their way to the nebula once the word got out that there was a place where the noise stopped. I was currently perched on top of the primary atmospheric processor in Sector 4, which I had renamed the Quiet Room. It was a massive chamber, formerly a storage bay for radioactive ore, which I had converted into a sanctuary. I'd used the Lumine crystal tech to build a series of dampening baffles into the walls, creating a zone of absolute, unadulterated stillness. I was tightening a bolt on a secondary cooling line, my hands moving with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the guts of machines. I was covered in grease. My jumpsuit was a patchwork of salvaged fabric, and I hadn't had a proper Earth-standard meal in 90 days. I had never been happier. "Daxen?" A small voice called out from the floor of the bay. I looked down. It was a young Lumini boy, no more than 6 years old. His skin was a pale, translucent white, and his ears were twitching in a frantic, uncoordinated dance. His Aegis silk robes were a jagged, painful red. "Hey there, kiddo," I said, wiping my hands on a rag and climbing down from the processor. "What's the word? Is the fan making that weird clicking noise again?" The boy didn't answer. He was clutching his head, his silver eyes wide with the sensory overload that came with being a young Lumini in a crowded station. Even here in the Reach, the collective hum of several thousand people could be overwhelming for a child who hadn't learned how to filter the noise. I walked over to him and sat down on the floor, the cold metal of the deck plates feeling solid and real through my pants. I didn't reach for my tools. I didn't call for a medical droid. I just sat there. I opened the doors of my mind. I didn't try to do anything. I just became the void. I let the silence that had once been my greatest shame radiate outward, a calm obsidian shadow that swallowed the jagged edges of the boy's panic. I felt the familiar heat behind my ear, the ghost resonance of my dead port, but it didn't hurt. It just felt like a warm breeze. I pulled the boy's red-hot fear into my mind and let it vanish into the dark. Slowly, the child's hands dropped from his ears. His robe settled into a soft emerald green. He took a long, shuddering breath and looked at me. He didn't see a hero or a savior. He just saw a man who was very, very quiet. "Better?" I asked, my voice a soft rasp. The boy nodded, a small, shy smile touching his lips. He reached out and touched my hand, his long, slender fingers tracing the scars on my knuckles. "Thank you, architect," he vibrated, his voice a tiny musical hum. "Go on," I said, giving him a gentle nudge toward the door. "Ilara's in the garden spire. She's working on those light sculptures you like." The boy scrambled away, his feet making a light, happy pitter-patter on the floor. I watched him go, a strange, tight feeling forming in my chest. It wasn't a psychic echo. It was a human emotion. I stood up and walked to the viewport, looking out at the Veil Nebula. It was a beautiful, chaotic clunker of a place. The hegemony was still out there, somewhere, probably drafting a new set of regulations to try and outlaw the existence of people like me. But they couldn't find us, not as long as I was here to keep the lights off. Thallin stepped onto the balcony beside me. She was wearing a simple tunic of blue luminized silk, her hair loose and free. She looked refreshed, her silver eyes bright and her ears relaxed. "The new filtration system is holding at 99%, she said, leaning against the railing. "Marlowe says the water tastes like actual water for once." "That's because I stopped using the recycled sweat collectors from Section 9, I said, giving her a crooked grin. "It's amazing what you can do with a bit of honest filtration and a lack of corporate oversight." She looked at me for a long time, the silence between us a comfortable, shared space. You're different, Daxen. I shrugged. I'm still a gearhead, Thalen. I still think the universe is held together by duct tape and stubborn hope. No, she said, reaching out to touch the scarred patch behind my ear. You used to be afraid of the dark. Now you are the one who makes it safe for everyone else. You've stopped trying to find a place where you fit in, and you've started building one. I looked down at my hands. They were the same hands that had once felt empty and useless on the Calum spire. But as I looked at them now, I saw the history of every machine I had fixed, every life I had touched, and every ghost I had saved. I spent 32 years of my life believing that being a void echo was a curse. I grew up in a world where connection was everything, where your value was measured by how much you could echo the thoughts and feelings of the people around you. Because I couldn't hear the music, I assumed I was broken. I spent every waking moment trying to fix my defect, trying to fill the hole in my head with anything that would make me feel real. I used to look at the stars and feel like a ghost, a hollow man drifting through a loud and vibrant universe that had no room for someone who was silent. I was so busy being angry about what I wasn't that I never realized what I was. I am a harbor. I am the space between the notes. I am the one person who can stand in the middle of a psychic hurricane and not be swept away. I realize now that the biggest lie the hegemony ever told us was that we had to be connected to be complete. They turned our brains into a public square and then wondered why everyone was so tired of screaming. They forgot that for a soul to grow, it needs a place where it can be alone. It needs a sanctuary. My flaw saved 1,000 people, not because I was stronger or smarter, but because I was the only one who knew how to be empty. I've stopped trying to find a world that has a place for me. I've realized that I am the place. I am the architect of the silence. And for the first time in my life, the quiet is not an absence. It is a presence. It is a gift. And I am finally home. I sat back on a crate, picking up my heavy-duty wrench and wiping a smudge of grease from the handle. I looked at the shimmering crystals of the lumini and the rusted metal of the human station, and I realized that they worked better together when they weren't trying to be the same thing. The universe is a poorly maintained piece of hardware. It is vast, leaky, and prone to catastrophic failure. But as long as there's someone around who knows how to keep a cool head and a quiet mind, I think we're going to be just fine. I looked at the wrench, then at the viewport, and then at the alien queen who was waiting for me to walk with her in the garden. I've spent my whole life hiding the parts of me that didn't fit, only to find out those were the very parts the world needed most to survive the noise. It makes me wonder about the things you've been hiding about yourself, the flaws you think make you unworthy, or the defects you try so hard to mask. What if the very part of you that feels broken is actually the sanctuary someone else has been searching for? What is that one quiet, hidden piece of yourself that you've been trying to fix? And what would happen if you finally stopped fixing it and started wondering what it was actually meant to do? I stood up, cinched my utility belt tight, and followed Thalen toward the light sculptures. Tomorrow I have a fusion core to recalibrate, a council of ghosts to advise, and a young boy to teach about the beauty of the void. For a man who used to be a ghost, I've got a hell of a lot of living to do. I picked up a small discarded brass bolt from the floor, turned it over in my fingers, and dropped it into my pocket with a satisfied click. The universe was quiet, steady, and finally completely at peace.